But thank you everybody for being here today. It's great to see some new faces. My name is Margaret Creeder. I'm on the West Side Technical Committee and for the Washington Tree Farm Program. And my co-conspirators for this program are Holly Haley and Kelsey Ketchison, and they're both on the DNR Landowner Service Program for DNR. Yeah, I said that. Yeah. And we also want to thank John Matson here today to help us run the technology, and Elizabeth Ide online managing us from her abode there. And thank you so much for our speakers. They all are here today. It's so exciting to have so many different people coming in, and we're going to hear from them later. And also want to have a special thanks to the Bob Faulkner Forestry Education Grant, to Greg Edel and the UW Center for Sustainable Forestry, to the DNR Small Forest Landowner Service Program, and the Mason Conservation District. Just a couple of reminders. Restrooms are in the building here, and lunch will be in the building back here behind us. And our first break is going to be at 10:50, so you can refill your coffee then. And after that break, we're going to be going out to the Sugar Shack. So we'll just meet Patrick right here outside the door, and he'll take us on over there. And then lunch will be at 12. And if you had requested a dietary preference on the registration link, just let them know as you're going through the line. We'll just need your name to check off the list. Yeah. And it looks like everyone's in here, so we'll just go ahead and get started. We've got Derek Pierson here on the line, who's going to be our first speaker. We have a short bio in the agenda, but I'll just read that out for Derek right now. So Derek's a research soil scientist for the U.S. Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station. Derek's research program centers on the protection and rehabilitation of forest soil health and resilience, with an emphasis on disturbances like wildfire and climate change. Specific to the topic of biochar, Derek's team has multiple projects underway studying the use of biochar in forest soils as a carbon sequestration avenue and for the remediation of contaminated soils. Take it away.
Thanks. We didn't get a chance to test this. Hopefully everybody can hear me. And then hopefully the presentation will load up here. Let's see what I can do. Check. Okay. Looks like it's up. Cool. Great. Well, thank you for the introduction. Sorry I couldn't be there in person. Probably not the most excited to do a virtual presentation on your first part of the morning, but it's going to be fun. I promise it's going to be interesting. I spent the last week out putting in biochar sites, so I'm coming off 12 hours on the road, so forgive me if I'm a little fuzzy. But the topic of biochar is a really big one. It's kind of hard to encapsulate into one little talk, and that's just a perspective I wanted to give to you. As you'll see a lot of information that stems from agriculture or uses in South America and all the way around to forest systems and what we can do with slash and things like that. So it can be hard sometimes to kind of sift through what's out there and get to what's actually useful to your specific, management or operation, things like that. So I have some things in the presentation today that I really try to hit home on some real basic things that hopefully will allow you to go down whatever path you want to go, but also just some examples of what work we're doing and where things are currently maybe proceeding nicely or a little bit stalled up. Okay, so from the Forest Service perspective, our big reason to come to biochar is the amount of slash we have piling up. So we've had slash problems for decades, but with the bipartisan infrastructure bill, just a need to deal with the wildfire crisis, the amount of slash we have in our forests is just booming. We have, this number of 375 million dry tons of forest slash, that's an old number. We may be at twice that in the next 5 years. So the amount of forest slash we have to deal with is overwhelming, and currently the best way we have to get rid of that slash is just to go out and burn it. And this just comes with a whole list of problems. So it's the pros are that it's efficient and it's quick. The problem list that goes along with burning these slash files is even more extensive. So obviously we have air quality issues. We end up with soil issues under these piles. So, a lot of the soils can be kind of stagnant for decades after we burn a big pile like this picture. There's fire risk. I'm sure everyone's aware of the times that slash piles have gotten away and created larger wildfires. And these spots are just kind of litter a landscape, right? When we have this much slash, it's a bigger problem. When we don't have a lot of slash, we burn one pile, okay. When we have hundreds and thousands of piles across a forested area, this is not the best thing we can do. So biochar is the easy place to turn. I say easy in that it's a technology we're comfortable with, and it's something we can do right now. The logistics and the other things I'll talk about later are more difficult, but we're very certain of the ability to take slash, which we'd call a non-merchantable woody biomass, right? Something we can't sell and that we have nothing else to do with. By making biochar, we can give that material purpose. We can create a valuable product that, commercial industries and, a bio-based economy may be able to sell. And we can also make something that's useful in our own forest applications and is useful in agriculture. So we're really turning waste into value. And that's where from there, that's kind of where the topic explodes, right? Where do we go with the biochar? So, there's obviously a lot of research to do, but we have all these different areas where either the process of producing the biochar or applying it leads into different areas, from just bolstering productivity to improving fire safety. You can kind of read around this diagram that there's a lot of places that we can think about putting biochar to use. The process of making biochar isn't tremendously complicated. So you can kind of choose your own adventure of how you like to go about making biochar. One of the most promising routes to producing more biochar and sequestering more carbon is actually just changing the way we construct our burn piles. So if we construct the burn piles in a manner that limits oxygen flow, and then if we have the resources to extinguish that fire when most of the material is charred and not completely burned down to ash, we can actually make a decent amount of biochar just from a burn pile. No extra equipment necessary. Definitely not the most efficient way to do it, but by far the least expensive and the easiest, most approachable way to do it. So there are ways to make biochar without any extra kind of resources. The next step up, what I'd call more of the middle ground, are things like the ring of fire kiln, the box kiln. These are specially designed metal chambers. So they're not quite as simple as they look. They're not just a burn bin. They actually have walls and they route airflow in a way that kind of keeps the fire burning at the top, but limits oxygen flow in the bottom of the container. So what happens is you kind of char the material, and as that burns down, you put more material on top, keep the flames above what you previously burned, and you end up just filling the bottom of the bin with charcoal. And at the end of the day, you extinguish everything with a big old tank of water. So the big need that's different from a lot of other kind of fire-based fuel management operations is that you need water. If you don't put the material out, it's going to continue to smolder and you'll lose most of your char, or you'll end up with char that's not very reactive. We'll talk more about that in a minute. The big scale, major player is to go up to the high level of some of this specialized equipment like a carbonator and a char boss. So these are for folks like the Forest Service that are going to really work with a whole lot of material and expect to make char for a really long time. These units can process, a few tons of material an hour, produce a handful to 10 tons of biochar in a day, stuff like that. And they, especially the char boss, come with the added benefit of using an air curtain, kind of wrap the smoke that's produced back into the fire. So you end up with something that's limiting emissions, protecting air quality while also making a very efficient and high quality char. So like I said, you can choose your own adventure, your own price point. These are all good options. And there's a lot of resources out there that will tell you kind of where you can purchase this and how you can set this stuff up. A little bit about the Char Boss. This has been in our kind of communication news a lot the last couple of years. We received some funding to test out this unit. So we are, the US government, we are in no way advocating for anybody to buy one of these, but from the research side, this is new technology. So we got a couple of these and we pulled them out to see where's this useful? How does this thing work? It's something that's been in development with the Forest Service, kind of back and forth advising on what would be useful for, almost the last 10 years. And these units are pretty cool. I'll stand by, they do what they promise. They can take a wide variety of material and they can make a really nice biochar while keeping the air quality around you almost perfect. If you're 50 yards away from this thing, you might hear it. It has a loud generator, but you won't smell it. So it really does wrap, 90% or so of the emissions back into the unit. So it's a clean burn. They're very heavy. They're expensive. They're, $180,000, something like that. They weigh 17,000 pounds. So you don't just pull it around casually. There are some limitations, but for certain use scenarios, they're a pretty neat piece of equipment. So the other realm that biochar gets a lot of talk is about carbon emissions and carbon sequestration and climate smart and all this. And just to put some numbers on that for everybody. So what we're really doing, it's one of the more simple kind of equations. It's simple math for how we're saving carbon versus other things like soil carbon or atmospheric drawdown, other things that the math is a little hazier. The math here is really easy because we're burning all of this material. Current practice is 98, 99% loss of carbon when we burn these piles, right? So anything we do that retains some of that carbon is a net negative emission. So when we turn this material into biochar, we end up, depending on how you make the char and how efficient things are, sequestering about 20 to 40% of the carbon that would have gone to the atmosphere. So pretty easy math there. Some more numbers here from, specific to the Char Boss. Part of the reason we get up to that 20 to 40% number is that the biochar is extremely carbon rich. It has about twice as much carbon content as the organic material. So by mass, we may only get 10 or 15% back by mass in how much biochar we ended up with after we burn the slash down. But because it's 85% carbon content, this is where we get those higher numbers, 20 to 40% of the carbon retained in the material. That's a common, people see different numbers about mass versus carbon, and that's kind of the ratio you have to take into account. So reducing carbon emissions, obviously we have units that can both do this by air curtains, but we're also doing it by just, creating biochar. So this is, for the Forest Service, our main perspective is let's do less of what you see here. Let's turn a product that has no value into a product that does have value, that also pushes us in the direction of our climate goals. Those are all, to me, and hopefully to everyone, a pretty direct linkage that is straightforward, and we just need to figure out how to get there. Do we make the biochar? So that process of just reducing carbon emissions and doing something with the material other than burning just gets us as far as making the biochar. Once we have the biochar, what's kind of cool is there's a lot of different pathways we can then take it. So there's a lot of applications in forest soils. Biochar is great for mine lands. We'd love to get more biochar into agriculture and kind of complete this idea of forest to farm, where we're taking the excess organic matter that we have in our forests and we're using it to support agriculture, which in almost every way is always organic matter limited. So we take a surplus on one side and help it meet the needs of a depleted organic matter kind of operation, whether that's feedlots or farmland, croplands, whatever it may be. There's uses for biochar. And the uses from biochar come from some, slightly nerdy chemistry things, but really not anything that's as complicated as this all looks. So the big thing with biochar, why it's useful and what's maybe a little different from the charcoal in the bottom of your campfire, is that when you make biochar, you're shooting for a very specific kind of combustion point. You want to char the material, but the moment it gets charred all the way through, you want to stop that process. And if you're able to pull that off, what happens is you end up with a material that has just tremendous pore space. So you haven't combusted it so far that it's collapsed all of those structures, but you've combusted it far enough that it's opened up all of that internal structure. And now you have pore space that is just unbelievable. So one cubic, so 1 cubic meter of biochar, 4,000 hectares of space. That's, I like to say usually when I'm giving a presentation, I'm not there. I'm not exactly sure where you guys are sitting today, but for a lot of my conferences, that's like looking at everything as far as you can see and imagining that's how much pore space, just surface area you have in just 1 cubic meter of biochar. So sheerly by that much pore space, you have some reactivity. You just have so much space. But the other cool part about biochar is that because you did this kind of flash burn of the material, you left all of that internal structure in this weird mix of chemical states. So you have all this different types of sticky organic compounds that will grab onto anything and everything. So you've created a high surface area Velcro, essentially, if you think of it in chemical terms of just grabbing onto almost anything and everything. That's what's really cool about biochar. It's the pore space and that chemical reactivity that make it unique, that make it this really cool thing that we can use in a lot of different areas. If you over combust the material, you go too far, then it's not going to work as well, things like that. So it is different from the charcoal in your campfire in that you're kind of shooting for this very specific point in how it's created. Yeah, so what I was going to say here, this is the point in the conversation where I start to sound like a snake oil salesman. So, we have all of this great stuff, right? And it's kind of like, well, why aren't we using biochar everywhere if it's this amazing, what is this guy selling us? The careful part here is that everything I just said about biochar is true, but we have to go downstream to application. So there's the difference between potential and actual, application effectiveness. So just because biochar can do these things doesn't mean that it's the best fit, that it's going to improve productivity at every site. Like I just mentioned, in the way biochar is made, there are sometimes problems with how it's made. It wasn't made well, right? You end up with biochar that has less pore space than it should, and it's less reactive than we thought it would be. Things like that. And then there's also a lot of different questions about how to apply it, how much to put on the ground, things like that. So there's a lot of research we still have to do to help guide people about how we turn potential into effective application methods. And when these things go awry, that's how we end up with stories. I think for every person I meet who says, yeah, biochar has been great for us, we use it all the time, I meet somebody else who said, yeah, we tried this out and it really didn't do anything for us. And so there's a lot of gray area here. I acknowledge the snake oil side, but it doesn't mean we throw it out, right? It's just a work towards better understanding how we can make use of biochar. So a little bit more nuance about how biochar is created. We talked a little bit about the how you combust the material and the temperature and why that matters. The type of feedstock you use also matters. So if we make biochar with wood chips versus we make it with corn husk, we end up with a fundamentally different material. So this can be kind of challenging when people go out in the real world and say, well, I've heard about biochar, I want to use it. I think I'd like to give it a try, but what biochar do I get? I see all these different biochars, and Derek told me biochar is different by different feedstocks. Here's kind of my simple breakdown. So most any old biochar you can find, it's going to be good at storing water. It's going to have pore space. It's going to have some ion exchange capacity. It's going to be reactive. By nature of its being, it's going to be high in carbon content, and it's going to have a low bulk density. So if these, we'll talk a little bit more about how these come into practice, but if these are your primary goals, you can find any old biochar. Now, there's a whole industry out there now that is growing by the day of what I like to call designer biochars, or they'll call it activated biochar. This is where they make biochar either from a very specific feedstock or through some sort of pre or post treatment process that adds some other type of functionality, some other type of potential use. And a lot of times this is a really common one is biochar fertilizer, where they'll basically take the biochar, soak it in a vat of nitrogen, and then ship that out to you. And now you have a material that is, both good for storing water, but should also release some of that nitrogen. The research on how effective that is really uncertain. So could be great in certain instances, but I really don't know how great that is yet. And then there's also ways that we can do things to make unique binding properties. So there's some things that through the addition of like iron, we can now bind other elements better. So say you have a selenium problem, that's one specific to iron, where you can kind of enhance your biochar. These things are out there. They're sold just like you might imagine through the chemical companies and things, and they'll tell you they're the latest, greatest. And I think if they fit your use case, that's great. But don't let them detract from kind of this top portion of any old biochar. The designer biochars are more of a specialized use case scenario, and they're going to come at a higher price point. Pop-ups here. So I have my video in the way. I'm sorry. Move it to the other side here. So there's more variables here that will then determine how your biochar works. So there's all these properties in the biochar, but your on-site factors like pH, climate, the existing nutrient availability, and how much biochar you use are all going to be highly influential about how biochar is going to improve whatever operation you're dealing with. Okay, so kind of long-winded part there, but I'm going to break some of that into this 1980s style figure that I'm not essentially super proud of. It looks pretty old, but I'm hoping that makes it memorable, because if there's anything to remember from this entire presentation, try to remember this figure. These are my 4 things that biochar can do for you. So from a land manager's perspective, if you're going, I've heard about biochar, but I'm not certain where it fits into what I'm doing. If you have issues with any of these 4 things, biochar may be useful to you. I'll put the 2 at the top are kind of the most dominant. Biochar is really good at storing water and extending water availability in the growing season. That is, most applications, that is where it's helping things. The second thing it's doing can be binding up soil contaminants. So if you have acidity, if you have some amount of toxic metals, things like that, biochar is uniquely capable of binding up and reducing some of the bioavailability of those contaminants. Now, it's not your be-all, end-all treatment. If you have, toxic orange waste sludge, you're never going to get enough biochar in there to pull it out. But if you have a site with a pH of 4.2 and you need that pH to be 4.5, biochar could probably help. So binding up soil contaminants, reducing acidity. Carbon sequestration is in there just by the sheer practice of making the biochar. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute, but the carbon savings are something that we're still working on figuring out, carbon credits and whatnot. But finally, soil structure. Biochar is very light, is very porous. It reduces bulk density, so it can be used to help kind of keep your soils, more porous and improve infiltration and things like that. So these are the areas biochar can help. The one to notice that is not on here is it's not a fertilizer. A lot of people can get that mixed up when we see those designer biochars where they're soaking it in nitrogen. Biochar itself, when it gets burned up and made and combusted, all of the nutrients, all the nitrogen, the phosphorus in there is volatilized. It's all lost. So it's 85% carbon. The other 15% is mostly, other metals and things like that. The amount of nutrients in biochar is essentially none. And there's some studies that actually show concerns about the biochar binding up some of the nutrients you have. In practice, we've seen that's true, but we've seen in a quantity that rarely matters. So one important caveat is don't go around thinking that biochar is a fertilizer. In fact, it's often best combined with something that is more of a fertilizer or provides nutrients, something like compost. You get the double benefit of kind of improving soil structure and water storage, and then you put the fertilizer in through something else. Okay, so a little bit about moisture retention. One unique note there is that your gains are going to be better in coarse textured soils. This is basic soil science. Clay textured soils already hold water a whole lot better. It's that simple. So if you have a soil that's not holding water, you have a coarser, sandier soil, adding biochar, you can get a lot bigger boost to your available water. So something to think of if you're dealing with a very clayey soil, biochar incorporation rates are going to be slower and your benefits are going to be less. And depending on your climate, may not be your problem to begin with. Heavy metal immobilization. So this is that binding capacity I was talking about. The interesting thing here is that other solutions tend to be very, very expensive. So folks like the EPA run around with their tens of millions of dollar budgets to bind up heavy metals. And in a lot of cases, I'm not trying to knock that. It's very much needed, but it's expensive, right? Biochar is the low-cost solution in the room. So it is something we can create from something like Slash, put on a contaminated area and see how far it gets us. And we can often pull that off in a month with limited environmental impacts, nothing concerning. If the biochar doesn't work, it's not going to hurt us anywhere else. And costs of covering something like a football field are going to run in the $10,000, $20,000 compared to the EPA spending $1 million. So there's opportunity there. It's not the solution everywhere, but there's opportunity there, especially when it comes to our abandoned mine lands. So abandoned mine lands litter, especially the Western United States. A lot of public lands have these areas, but even private lands have old mining operations in places where their soils have been degraded in one way or another from past activities. And biochar is a really great way to see if through a quick, relatively low cost option, how much can we improve this area? We just cover it in biochar, give it some time and see what happens. Okay, so jump in here to a few different kind of application specifics. One of my favorite applications for biochar is like I just mentioned, the low cost, low risk application. This is a mine site just north of me here in Boise, where we're just seeing what biochar can do, because this site's going downhill fast and there's no money to do anything grand and kind of give it what it needs. So let's put biochar out there. When it comes to soil carbon sequestration, a little bit more about that story. A lot of folks ask, why don't we just leave the slash out there to decompose? And the answer is really that we actually study how fast these things decompose. So that there's huge amounts of literature. Part of what I did my original PhD on is understanding how organic matter decomposes and how long that takes and where does the carbon end up. And the story kind of breaks down like this, that your finer litter materials, your leaves, your pine needles take about a year on average to go away. You started getting into wood chips up to logs, you're at 10 to 100 years. the carbon that makes it into the soil and binds to mineral surfaces and things like that, we start seeing persistence, 75, 200, maybe 300 years at best. Almost everything we have that we can point to about biochar says that it persists wherever you put it for 300 years or longer. Some folks will stretch that number out to 1,000 years. It's a little bit debated, but it's one of the longest persisting forms of organic matter we know of. And the reason for that is what I just told you previously. It has no nutrients in it. So it also has a very complex structure, but those two things combined mean that microbes have a terrible time breaking it down. And even if they can break it down, so there are many species of fungi that can kind of blow up biochar using peroxidases and some really cool enzymes, like they can break it down. But the return to that microbe is nothing they need. They're not getting the nitrogen or the phosphorus that they're really after. So some fungi in certain cases will mine it for carbon, but really microbes have adapted to be smart. They go after that stuff and they say that's not useful to me, so they just let it sit there. So it persists for a really long time, and that's where we get this kind of great carbon sequestration opportunity that's unique relative to just leaving the organic material in the forest. There's a whole bigger, like, national global scale to all of this carbon stuff. And this is still kind of panning out, but because the math is so simple behind biochar, it is a leading part of our climate mitigation strategy. And there are some studies out there that show really big numbers about how if we switched our entire land management operation to make, prioritizing the production of biochar, we could reduce our climate footprint by, 12%, things like that. Great in concept. In practice, we are the tiniest of tiny baby steps towards any of this. So this isn't kind of the fix-all just yet. It's a lofty goal, but biochar is better thought of at this scale, I think. So thinking about a forest scale or things like that, and what carbon savings we have here, this is the tip of the iceberg, right? If we say out of the 140,000 piles we had on this forest in Colorado, if we made biochar rather than burning those, we go through the math and we can kind of equate it to saying, well, we took 7,000 vehicles off the road for a year, right? That's great. That's progress. That's something. But the global story is still a little bit hazy about how we get to something that is large enough to be impactful. But that's not to overshadow the fact that these things can be very impactful and very helpful and even economically practical at smaller scales. So finish up here, a couple more things, few quick examples, mostly for the pictures. So, and specific to the Pacific Northwest, I kind of went through my research site log and found places where we had done things with biochar. So this is on the Umpqua. You can see the area without the biochar and the area that we put biochar in. This is only, I believe this is like 18 months after the application. And not the best angle, but we, in our measurements and whatnot, we have significantly more vegetation coming back where we put down biochar. This is the Stanislaus National Forest, stretching the bounds of the Pacific Northwest here. This is, Central California, but similar climates. This is an area that had been really hit by fire and drought and insects. I wanted to throw this picture in here to show that in most forest applications, you can see how we're just top dressing the soil with biochar. Most forest soils, you're going to do more harm than good breaking up the soil. So unless you're already doing that for another reason, the application method we use for biochar is to put it on the surface. It's light. A lot of folks expect it'll wash or blow away. Some amount does, but not usually to a concerning degree. So putting the biochar on the top of the soil and giving it time is a perfectly practical way to use biochar if you're not already disturbing the soil. If you are tilling the soil or doing something for another reason, by all means, go ahead and mix in the biochar and you'll get more bang for your buck right away. So newer site that we just put in out here on the Caribou Targhee, that's in eastern Idaho. This site has a lot more water quality issues. So this is one of the sites we're hoping to see, some improvement in reducing the bioavailability of some of the toxic water that's flowing through the system. Just another application of what these sites tend to look like when we go and put biochar on top. Post-wildfire landscapes, we're really trying to spin up more work here because obviously we tend to have such large amounts of salvage timber and logging going on. That's a really easy place to make biochar on site, and then trying to look at the effects of putting it down. And we're starting to have a few studies that are super obvious, like this one. So the entire area you can see here, look, unfortunately this picture is not a little wider, but the whole area is seeded exactly the same. And it's this one patch with biochar that's growing far more vegetation, and that's simply because it's holding water. The biochar is providing water here, whereas the rest of this soil has been so disturbed by the fire that its water storage capacity is none. Most of it's going to run off due to hydrophobicity, and the amount that does infiltrate probably infiltrates below the surface where these seeds really need to germinate. So pretty effective in this case, but we still have a ways to go about learning more about wildfire applications. Finally, we've been pushing quite a few folks to make biochar figure out what to do with it later, right? So we know we'll find uses for it. But there's some low-hanging fruit opportunities where it's like you have this operation, you have this great place to get some equipment out there. Let's make biochar, pile it up, put it in under a tarp, in a shed, whatever, and we'll use it on restoration projects downstream. So that's exactly what's some of this work in Mount Hood areas doing, is they just recognized a really great opportunity to make biochar with some of their operations, and then they'll figure out where it's best used later. But finally, one plug for a recent publication we put out, going back to a little bit of the snake oil part of, well, biochar does all these great things. Why haven't we been using it for the last 100 years? Where is biochar? And certainly there are a lot of old stories and history of native populations using biochar and things like that, but it's really hasn't taken hold in our land management practices, even globally, where biochar still is in this spin up stage, and it feels like we've been in that stage for a long time. So a whole team here at RMRS got around this idea of like, why is that? What are we missing? Why is this not taking off? And we set out to talk to everybody we could pull in between Colorado and areas in Montana, and then further into the Pacific Northwest, have these conversations of folks that are interested in biochar but have had issues. And what we did through these workshops and these conversations is we really started writing down what are the problems, and the outcome of that research really was that the practice of producing and applying biochar is, for lack of a better term, death by 1,000 cuts. There's like 90 something different issues in here that are all unique and span this x-axis range of different areas, right? Whether it's economic issues or integration into operations or permits, or we need to know more about science and how these things work, and market supply, just a whole bunch of things combined to just one roadblock after another, until people just kind of finally say, this is just not worth my time anymore. So the pathways we have for producing and utilizing biochar are circuitous at best, right? They're really, we're not making it easy on ourselves. So put out a publication this spring, first part of the year, to at least try to help folks be aware of some of the issues they may be facing when they get into biochar, so that you can kind of know these things up front. And then it'd be kind of a doomsday publication if we didn't also include some strategies for how we move past some of these things. And let's go from 1 year to 10 years and say, how do we break down as many of these barriers as possible? What's that going to take? So that's the back half of this paper. It's a little bit I'll be the first to say it's a little bit ambitious, but it's at least a roadmap forward. So a lot of these issues really break down to policy and permitting are the biggest issues. Economic viability, if we can make biochar turn into a green profit margin for folks, we'll get more use of biochar, and some of that may come along as we improve the ability to get carbon credits, money for just making biochar. Those two things are the big part. And then the third one is honestly my domain. It's research. We still have to help people identify where biochar is very, very likely to be a benefit to their operation. As we continue to go around and talk about the potential, but then we have all these facets and inability to predict if it's actually going to be helpful to you and exactly where you are and what you're doing, then it's risky, right? The risk may be too high to really invest in utilizing biochar. So we've got to do better research. We've got to understand the science better so that we can reduce the risk of buying in. It's exactly one project I'm really excited about, that came directly out of these workshops and the just dozens of conversations I had with folks about what do you think biochar could do on my field? It's about like this, pH 5, they give me the whole thing. And I'd always have to say, I don't know. I can't, we're just not that far along. So we put together a study, now has, I think we're at 12 or 14 sites across the country utilizing the same biochar, same study design. We're making an entire network where we can start to piece together what types of applications and land disturbances and things like that lead to benefits from biochar application versus where do we find that we didn't get much improvement, that it may not be worth the cost. 12 or 14 sites is not enough to get all the way through that. There's too much variability, but it's a start. The US government has invested in this. We hope to continue investing in this and building this network so that we can get better information out there to really pinpoint, my favorite term, the low-hanging fruit. Where is it an obvious best bang for your buck to say, if you use biochar, this is really going to help you out. So we're on our way. This is a 5-year study. We're just entering year 2. So, hopefully maybe I get an invite back in a few years and we'll see how all this shakes out. So thank you very much for your time. I tried to leave a few minutes for us to chat if anybody has questions. And if you have more specific things you'd like to discuss, I'm always available by email. Feel free to reach out. I'm happy to chat about biochar anytime.
What's your figures on the cost of doing bio stuff over just finding the stuff and leaving it or chipping it up? You got some sort of chart per acre or what do you got?
So chipping is going to be far, far cheaper. That's how it works out. So the cost of making biochar really depends on everybody's situation and the type of equipment you plan to use and what you may already have. If you have a water truck or not, costs can really change. So it's tough to put a dollar value on. But I think the crux of to answer your question is if you have material that you want to just simply reduce, chipping it, if you don't have a use for the biochar, if you're not in need of any of those 4 things, that pie diagram I was showing about, if that's not the priority, if the priority is just reducing the material, chipping is easily the way to go.
Yeah, I have a question on the biochar production method. When you're using some of these simpler methods like the pile burning and the kiln burning, how do you know? I mean, I'm sure it's a spectrum, but how do you know it's actually producing what you want as opposed to just charcoal?
Yeah, good question. Good question. So this is actually something I harp on quite a bit. So the folks that we tend to see two groups using those types of methods. We see the groups that have been doing it for a decade or more and are really the founders of those methods. They make tremendously good quality char and efficient char with those methods, but it comes with a decade of experience. So the person who buys one of those units and has never made char before and goes out for the first day and tries to make biochar in a kiln is going to have to go through a learning curve of exactly how to do that. There is not a great, kind of signpost for, say, add water now or add more material now. It is an experience-based thing using those kilns. So there's a lot of resources online, videos, and the folks in that kind of have provided the technology for those types of kilns are very responsive. There's a lot of ways to learn, but there is a learning curve to make sure you're making good char, and that can be a problem. Things like the Char Boss are more foolproof. It has a conveyor belt that brings the char out as soon as it's made into a water tin. So those are some of the advantages you get with larger technology. But all that being said, I think if you spent 2 weeks running a kiln, you can tell whether you're making good char or not simply by how much ash you're producing. If you're producing a lot of ash, then you're over combusting your biochar. If you're getting material, if you break apart your biochar and it's not roasted all the way through, you're not combusting it enough. So there are some simple ways to kind of look at the process, but it is experience-based.
Okay, cool. I'm kind of wondering about the application for biochar in urban environments, areas in which there might be high soil compaction, low organic matter, heavy metal, through industry. Is there any research on application there? Would you recommend it for people with home gardens? Remediation of urban environments, etc. What do you have on that?
Yeah. I can't think of a tremendous amount of real scientific literature on urban environments. I'm sure there's some. I don't know that there's enough to be consensus, but it's no different from where we're at with biochar everywhere else. A lot of the issues we're looking to solve in soils are the same issues, whether they're in urban environments or they're in a mine site. The practicality of it right now, to be really straight with you guys, is that we're still building up our research base to better predict where biochar is going to be effective and how much biochar you need to use. So we're sitting at a time where we can kind of say, yeah, that should work well for you, but we can't guarantee it. So anywhere you can, it's great to do a pilot project. So that's my number one thing I advise to everyone in the Forest Service right now is I can kind of give you a good, there's a high likelihood that this is really going to help, but I can't give you a guarantee. So if that's an urban environment would be no different. If you have a smaller part of your project where you can use some biochar and see how it goes and come back the following year and say, was this effective for my specific soil, my specific situation? That's going to be your best approach. Beyond that, it's looking at the data that's available and making your best guess. Yeah, you would hope after all this time with biochar that we would have a better answer than that. But that's the truth of it, is pilot studies are still the best way to go.
All right, we got a question from online. Do you see a benefit in spreading biochar on forest roads and trails for absorption of vehicle contaminants?
Absorption of vehicle contaminants. So yes, it would work. some of the issues there would be how much are those contaminants actually affecting your site productivity, right? So I think some of the areas where we've seen biochar applications go after road contaminants, and especially things like salts that are used for de-icing your roads and things, is about limiting how far those things are reaching. So putting the biochar in the road or on the road to try to bind up what there isn't necessarily a site that you're looking to actually kind of have great productivity. But offsite is, so you can use things like, wattles, round tubular sacks of biochar to try to reduce the amount of water transport of the contaminants from your roads and things like that. It's a very viable, the biochar will absolutely help bind up those things. It becomes then a source versus sink problem. How big is your source of contaminants versus how big is the sink that you can bind up with your tube of biochar? So if you have a really, really active road, you're going to fill up your biochar and you'll be right back where you started. If you have a less active road, we've seen those things work pretty well because you can get a good longevity out of your biochar absorption capacity.
I'm curious about the quantity or rates of application for, let's say, a mine site remediation for hectare, what unit application amounts?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? I couldn't quite make that one out.
I'm curious about the volume of biochar that would be applied for certain applications.
Sure. Yeah, great question. Something I didn't cover super well in the talk. So good question. Thank you. So some numbers. So 10 tons of biochar. So there's actually, this is the one thing we do have a lot of research on. So I've been saying, we need more research. The one thing that scientists have done a ton of is how different is it if I add a little or a lot or a crazy amount? That's most of the research out there. My consensus of reviewing that literature is that it takes usually about 10 tons per hectare of biochar to really start to do anything that's all that useful. It's usually 20 tons per hectare where you're starting to reach kind of the best bang for your buck. All of these numbers are dependent on your site and your situation, but this is kind of the average across different studies. It's about 20 tons where it seems like you're going to get the best bang for your buck. And as you start to add more, you can get more benefits. You can get more water storage. You can bind more contaminants, but you reach a point where you're starting to get less and less of a return. It's a diminishing return after 20 tons per hectare a lot of times. Something to be careful of, a lot of science is based on trying to figure out where can we find the maximum amount of benefit. That is the research approach a lot of times. So folks that want to ensure that they have a very obvious effect in their treatments will go out and they'll apply something like 50 tons per hectare. I've seen 100 tons per hectare. That's like shin deep of biochar, right? Some of that's in the literature and is absolutely impractical for almost all land management applications. So a lot of the Forest Service-based research tends to be more on the other end of how much do we need before we even get any return? And then let's only go up so high as is, kind of tangible, right? So even 20 tons per hectare is quite a bit of biochar. 20 tons per hectare is about one kind of layer of even coating of biochar across the surface of your soil. That's what 20 tons per hectare looks like. Mine sites are the exception to all of these things. Where you have contaminant issues, sometimes you have to add as much biochar as it's going to take to sufficiently reduce the bioavailability of that contaminant. And that's very site dependent. So that's beyond that. If it's just about vegetation and rehabilitation, then the numbers I just gave you really are kind of what we're using.
Thank you, Derek. I think it's time for our next speaker. So any further questions, just reach out to Derek, through his email.